I think the way that Hamas pulled off the attack on October 7th showed that the movement had really been developing its military infrastructure and strategically planning for an opportune time for it to disrupt the balance of forces on the ground. So I have written in the past about the relationship between Hamas and Israel being one that I have described as a violent equilibrium, where Hamas was effectively contained within the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinians in Gaza were placed under a violent blockade. And that equilibrium was one that was negotiated through violence. So whenever the restrictions on Gaza became too overwhelming, Hamas would fire rockets at Israel and initiate a ceasefire negotiation that would ultimately result in the easing of the restrictions on the blockade for a period of time. And in response, Israel expected quote unquote calm within the communities around the Gaza Strip and sort of maintain this calm maintain this expectation of calm despite the presence of the blockade. And in so doing, enabled or tolerated Hamas's presence as the governing authority in the Gaza Strip. This dynamic worked for a period of 16 years. Of course, it didn't account for the extreme suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. Israel didn't consider its blockade to be something that would explain or justify any kind of resistance from the Gaza Strip. But over the course of the past few years, we've seen Hamas starting to shift its strategy. So now, in retrospect, it's much clearer to see. But for example, in 2018, Hamas gave permission and facilitated the Great March of Return protests, which were organized and planned by civil society in Gaza. And we saw this as an effort by Hamas to support and encourage alternative forms of protest against the blockade, in this case, popular resistance. And rather than allow for international support, there was actually international silence, more or less, about the protests, and Israel responded with live fire, killing more than 200 Palestinians, including medics and journalists, and maiming thousands of Palestinians. So that was one episode in which we saw Hamas begin to negotiate a different tactic to challenge the blockade than its sort of traditional use of rocket fire. And then in 2021, we saw another development, which was Hamas using rocket fire to protest Israeli forced dispossession of Palestinians in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. So this was during the Unity Intifada in 2021. And we saw Hamas use rocket fire in this instance as a way of challenging not only the blockade, but also Israel's colonial violence against Palestinians more broadly than just the Gaza Strip. So those, in retrospect, those two milestones for me indicate a shift in Hamas's strategy towards its engagement with Gaza and the beginning of an effort to disrupt its containment in the Gaza Strip. And fast forward to 2023, on October 7th, we see what is a very effective campaign operation by Hamas that entirely disrupted the paradigm that Israel had held onto, which is that it can maintain Hamas contained in Gaza and Palestinians under a blockade and expect no resistance. So within the space of a few hours, Hamas was able to totally disrupt that paradigm, and more broadly, the paradigm that Zionists hold on to, which is that Israeli Jews can have safety in Israel while an apartheid regime against Palestinians continues to operate, as in that Israel is able to maintain its colonization of Palestinians in a cost-free manner. So Hamas obviously disrupted that through its operation. It also shattered the notion that Israel has that it can maintain security for Israeli Jews indefinitely without dealing with the Palestinian political demands. Now, the operation was really successful in the core fact of it being able to shatter the idea that Israel was invincible. So this myth of Israeli invincibility, the fact that the blockade was seen to be impenetrable, was shattered within the space of a few hours. And I think part of the reaction that we're seeing now in the Gaza Strip is driven by that, the sense that the deep need for Israel to try to overcome its humiliation and its defeat and to try to rebuild deterrence. But that, of course, is not going to be possible after Hamas's success. The fourth day of the ceasefire agreement, in which Hamas is releasing captives, a number of captives into Israel, and the Israelis are releasing Palestinian prisoners to the West Bank. Now, it's important to note a few things about this ceasefire agreement. The first is that this is in some ways the same ceasefire agreement that had already been on the table a few weeks ago. So about 3 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken. And it shows that over the course of this period, when Israel expanded its genocidal violence against the Gaza Strip, it hasn't been able to get or secure any additional military or political demands. Not only has Hamas's military not necessarily been challenged effectively, but ceasefire agreements still hold onto the same stipulations, which means that Hamas is still negotiating from a position of relative power. And so this means that there's been really no reason, political or military reason, for the level of violence that Israel unleashed on the Gaza Strip that could have justified that violence, other than really just to count up the number of civilian deaths and the level of infrastructure destruction in the Gaza Strip. So it's important to sort of note that this was something that could have been achieved weeks ago before this level of violence in Gaza. The second thing that's important to note is that even though this operation by Israel has been ongoing, and the Israeli government has even the past couple of days confirmed that they would still, even if they do extend the truce, they would still want to go back with the goal of destroying Hamas, quote unquote, that goal seems increasingly unlikely, specifically because it's very clear that there hasn't been any major success in terms of military defeat of Hamas. The operations that the Israelis have carried out in Gaza have all been shown to fail at either releasing the captives. The captives are being released now under a ceasefire agreement, not by Israeli forces, or to really register any destruction of military capacity or the death of major military targets. Or the officials within Hamas. So it's unclear exactly what Israel has gained militarily from this operation. And it's important to keep this in mind when we think about the goal of destroying Hamas. That goal is nothing less than a call for a sort of a carte blanche for Israel to continue its violent operations against Gaza, because Hamas, even if its military cadre was significantly challenged or even hit, it's the goal of dismantling the organization, given its reality as a political organization and a social organization, is near impossible. So the way that we should be understanding or looking at the current ceasefire negotiations is to suggest that actually Hamas has been able to hold ground quite strongly, and Israel is being forced onto the table to negotiate for the release of the captives. So this is a far cry from the sort of the grand goals that Israel had justified at the beginning. The other way of saying this, or sort of understanding this operation, is to see it as a way for Israel to push forward goals it had harbored long before October 7th, which are goals aimed at ethnically cleansing Palestinians and ridding Israel of the Gaza problem, quote unquote, the strip of land where the majority of the Palestinians, 2.3 million Palestinians, are refugees demanding to return home. And the early days of this war, which saw Israel put forward the idea of expulsion under the guises of a humanitarian corridor, sort of underpins this motivation by Israel in terms of the violence it's unleashing in Gaza.